Fake money greetings for the BS, Black Struggles YouTube channel. Welcome to BS, Black Struggles. Globe Fire. This is where we share, listen and get inspired by challenging journeys. Get stronger through every difficulty. Rise from hardship. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to create a sustainable community together. Let's rise together. Raised fist medium dark skin tone sparkles. Would you like to add any specific details or messages? White cop lies about black woman in court not knowing she's a high-ranking Navy SEAL. You underestimated me, Officer Simmons, but the truth always finds a way. What could make a courtroom fall silent in shock? A police officer accuses a black woman of resisting arrest and assault. His story convincing until she takes the stand and turns the entire case upside down. Who is she and why does her testimony leave the officer, the jury, and even the judge stunned? This is the story of how one lie unraveled and a fight for justice became a fight for truth. Let's dive into it. The early morning sun peeked through the heavy drapes of the courtroom, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. The room, though grand in design, felt suffocating. Rows of wooden benches were filled with a mix of spectators, curious townsfolk, journalists jotting notes, and a few faces lined with quiet tension. Among them sat Lena, her calm exterior betraying none of the turmoil beneath the surface. Her dark brown skin glowed faintly under the artificial light, and her neatly braided hair rested on her shoulders. Monica sat upright, her back straight as if guided by an invisible string, her hands clasped lightly in front of her. She was dressed modestly in a crisp white blouse and black slacks, a deliberate choice to exude humility and respect, yet her sharp eyes scanned the room with precision, taking in every face, every movement. To the casual observer, she looked like any other defendant, but to those paying close attention, there was something unusual about her, a quiet intensity that seemed out of place for someone accused of a violent crime. The bailiff called the court to order and all eyes turned to the front of the room where Judge Howard Grayson, an older white man with thinning silver hair, entered. He carried an air of authority, though face betrayed a weariness that came from years of presiding over cases. He'd rather forget. This one, however, seemed to ignite a spark of interest in him. Perhaps it was the presence of Officer Bradley Simmons sitting smugly at the plaintiff's table, or the murmurings of a case that had already captured the attention of local news outlets. State versus Lana, the bailiff announced, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. Mon rose, her movements deliberate and controlled, and faced the judge. The whispers in the room grew louder as people craned their necks for a better view. Officer Simmons leaned back in his chair, his expression one of confidence, almost amusement. Dressed sharply in his police uniform, the officer exuded the kind of arrogance that comes from years of unquestioned authority. Lana's lawyer, Benjamin Carter, a young black attorney fresh out of law school, shuffled nervously through his notes. He glanced at Lana, hoping to find reassurance in her face, but she didn't return the look. Her eyes remained fixed on the judge, her expression unreadable. Carter took a deep breath and stood. Your Honor, he began, his voice wavering slightly. We are prepared to proceed. The judge nodded, his gaze shifting to Simmons. Officer Simmons, you may take the stand. The officer rose, every movement exaggerated as if he were performing for an unseen audience. He adjusted his uniform before making his way to the witness stand, pausing briefly to glance at Monica. His smirk was faint but unmistakable, a predator sure of his prey. As he took the oath, Lana studied him. She observed the way his fingers fidgeted slightly, the subtle shift in his posture as he sat down. These were details most would overlook, but Lana catalogued them with the precision of someone trained to read body language. She didn't flinch, didn't move as Simmons began to speak. On the evening in question, Simmons began, his voice steady and loud enough to carry across the room. I was responding to a disturbance call near the east side of town. I encountered the defendant, Miss Jackson, loitering outside a closed business. There were murmurs in the courtroom. Loitering was often used as a catch-all accusation, especially against people of color. Simmons pressed on, seemingly unfazed. When I approached her and asked what she was doing there, she immediately became hostile. He continued, his tone taking on a theatrical quality. She refused to identify herself, raised her voice, and when I attempted to de-escalate the situation, she physically assaulted me. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Monica remained still, her face a mask of calm. Simmons shifted in his seat, feigning a pained expression. She hit me in the chest and attempted to reach for my service weapon. At that point, I had no choice but to restrain her. From the back of the room, a woman's voice muttered, sounds like a lie. Heads turned, but the judge quickly called for order. Thank you, Officer Simmons. Judge Grayson said, his voice neutral, you may step down. Monica's lawyer rose, visibly nervous. Your Honor, before we continue, I'd like to ask the court to consider save it for your cross-examination. Mr. Carter, the judge interrupted. Let him move on. Monica exhaled softly. Her patience was being tested, but she didn't let it show. She leaned slightly toward Carter, whispering, stay calm, focus on the facts. Carter nodded, though he looked far from reassured as the prosecution rested its case. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier. Simmons returned to his seat, his smirk now a full grin. He exchanged a glance with his fellow officers seated in the back row. Lana didn't miss the wink he gave them. Miss Jackson, the judge said, his tone carrying an edge of skepticism, it's your turn to testify. Monica stood smoothing her blouse as she approached the stand. The room fell silent as she took her seat, the weight of 100 stairs pressing down on her. She adjusted the microphone in front of her, her movements slow and deliberate. Miss Jackson, the prosecutor began, a middle-aged man with a sharp suit and sharper tongue, can you explain Your actions on the night in question. Lana leaned forward slightly, her voice steady and measured. But first I need to clarify one thing. The officer's account is not only inaccurate, but intentionally misleading. There was a collective intake of breath. The prosecutor smirked. Bold accusation. Miss Jackson, do you have any proof to back it up? Lana met his gaze, her dark eyes unyielding. I believe the truth will come to light soon enough. The prosecutor opened his mouth to retort, but Lana's calm confidence left him momentarily. Speechless. Judge Grayson cleared his throat, signaling for the questioning to continue as Lana began to recount her version of events. The tension in the room became palpable. The audience hung on her every word, sensing that this was no ordinary defendant. Unbeknownst to everyone, the wheels of justice were already turning, and the carefully constructed lies of Officer Simmons were beginning to unravel. Lana sat on the stand, her posture as unwavering as her composure. She took a moment before speaking, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the wooden railing. The courtroom silence was suffocating, every breath held in anticipation of what she might say. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm but carried an undeniable strength. On the night in question, she began, her eyes sweeping across the courtroom. I was on my way home from visiting a friend. I stopped near the corner of Magnolia and Fifth to check my phone for directions. She paused briefly, allowing the detail to sink in. That's when Officer Simmons approached me. The prosecutor leaned forward, ready to pounce. And you're saying this encounter was completely UN-provoked? Lana tilted her head slightly, her expression unwavering. Not entirely. I was standing on the sidewalk, which as far as I know isn't illegal. He approached me with his flashlight pointed directly at my face and asked in a tone I wouldn't call friendly what I was doing there. And how did you respond? The prosecutor asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. I told him I was checking directions, Lana replied evenly. He asked for my identification. I asked if I'd done anything wrong. The prosecutor seized the moment. So you questioned his authority? I questioned his motive, Monica corrected, her voice firm but not aggressive. I wasn't obstructing traffic, trespassing, or causing any disturbance. I wanted to know why he was asking for my ID. There was a ripple of murmurs in the courtroom. Judge Grayson banged his gavel lightly. Order in the court. Lana continued, her tone unchanging. When I asked for clarification, he raised his voice and accused me of being uncooperative. I told him I wasn't trying to cause any trouble, but before I could say anything else, he grabbed my arm. Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow, clearly trying to decide how to twist her testimony to his advantage. Are you claiming the officer physically restrained you without cause? Monica nodded yes, and when I told him to let go, he tightened his grip. He said, and I quote, "Women like you need to learn how to listen." Gasps erupted from the gallery. This time the judge's gavel came down harder. Order. I will not tolerate interruptions. The prosecutor forced a smile. Miss Jackson, that's a serious allegation. Do you have any proof of this statement? Lana looked directly at him, her gaze unflinching. No, because the body camera he was wearing conveniently malfunctioned. Isn't that right, Officer Simmons? All eyes turned to Simmons, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His confident smirk had faded, replaced by a slight clenching of his jaw. The prosecutor cleared his throat. Let's focus on the facts. Miss Jackson, you claim the officer restrained you. What happened next? Monica folded her hands in her lap, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. I told him I didn't consent to being touched and asked him to let me go. He didn't. Instead, he accused me of resisting arrest, even though I hadn't moved. When I tried to pull my arm away, he slammed me against the patrol car. Her words were a punch to the gut. For everyone listening, a few people in the audience whispered to one another, their faces a mixture of disbelief and anger. The tension in the room was thick, and even the judge seemed momentarily taken aback, and after that the prosecutor pressed his tone more subdued. Now Lana's gaze didn't waver. He handcuffed me and told me I was under arrest for assaulting an officer. The prosecutor leaned back, trying to regain control of the narrative. Miss Jackson, you're a strong woman. Is it possible the officer felt threatened by your physical resistance? Monica didn't flinch. I'm not stronger than a trained police officer, and let's be clear, I didn't resist until he violated my rights. The prosecutor opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Monica added, I also didn't reach for his weapon. Despite his claims that was a fabrication to justify his use of force. The room seemed to freeze. Simmons shifted again, visibly uneasy. The prosecutor's face darkened as he struggled to maintain his composure. Miss Jackson, he said, his voice tight, you're asking this court to believe that Officer Simmons, a decorated member of the force, fabricated an entire incident. Do you have anything to back up your version of events? Monica smiled faintly, a subtle but powerful shift in her demeanor. The truth always has a way of revealing itself. Counselor, you'll see soon enough. The judge leaned forward. Miss Jackson, are you implying there is evidence the court has not yet seen? Monica's lawyer, Benjamin Carter, stood quickly. Your Honor, we intend to submit additional evidence during the proceedings. The prosecutor scoffed. More stalling tactics, Your Honor. If the defense had anything substantial, they would have presented it already. Lana turned to face the judge. Your Honor, the truth takes time, but I promise you this, when it comes out it will be undeniable. The judge studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. Very well, we'll reset for today. Court will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. As the gavel came down, the courtroom erupted into whispers. Lana rose from the stand, her movements calm and deliberate. She walked past Officer Simmons, who avoided her gaze, and joined her lawyer at the defense table. Are you sure about this? Carter whispered, his voice filled with doubt. Monica placed a Hand on his arm, her grip steady and reassuring. Trust me, Ben, tomorrow the truth will speak louder than anything Simmons could ever say. As she walked out of the courtroom, the murmurs of the crowd followed her, a mix of curiosity and speculation. Outside, the sun was setting, casting the town in a warm golden glow. Lana paused on the courthouse steps, her eyes scanning the horizon. The fight was far from over, but she was ready. She had always been ready. The courthouse emptied slowly, the day's tension still clinging to the air like a heavy fog. Monica stood at the edge of the courthouse steps, her silhouette framed against the orange hues of the setting sun. The hum of conversation and the shuffle of feet surrounded her, but she tuned it all out, her focus inward. She had faced tougher battles before, ones where survival wasn't guaranteed, but there was something uniquely suffocating about fighting in a courtroom where the truth could be buried under lies. Benjamin Carter appeared at her side, his face a portrait of concern. Turned, the young lawyer clutched his briefcase tightly as if it contained not just papers but the weight of his responsibility to her. Monica, he said hesitantly, his voice low enough to avoid drawing attention. We need to talk. She turned her head slightly, her gaze calm but unyielding. What's on your mind, Ben? He exhaled deeply, his breath visible in the cool evening air. You have to tell me what you're holding back. The judge knows it, the prosecutor knows it, and Simmons, he's getting nervous. Whatever ace you're hiding, I need to know before we walk back into that courtroom tomorrow. Lana's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. You'll know when the time is right. That's not enough, he pressed, lowering his voice even further. I'm your lawyer. If we're going to win this, I need to be prepared for whatever bombshell you're planning to drop. She studied him for a moment, the weight of her silence pressing down on him like a physical force. Finally she nodded. Meet me at my house tonight. I'll tell you everything. Benjamin blinked, startled by the sudden shift. I will, she said firmly, but not here. Lana's modest home sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by tall oak trees that swayed gently in the night breeze. The faint glow of a porch light illuminated the walkway, casting long shadows across the gravel path. Benjamin pulled up in his car, stepping out cautiously. The quiet of the area was almost unnerving after the chaos of the courtroom. He knocked lightly on the door, and Lana answered almost immediately, as though she'd been standing there waiting. She wore a simple navy sweatshirt and black leggings, a stark contrast to the poised appearance she'd maintained earlier in the day. Her hair was tied back, and her expression was unreadable. Come in, she said, stepping aside. Benjamin entered, his eyes scanning the space. The living room was neat and sparsely decorated, with only a few personal touches. A framed photograph of a younger Monica in a navy uniform, her arm around an older man in a similar uniform. A folded American flag displayed in a glass case on the mantel. A bookshelf filled with titles on leadership, strategy, and history. You live alone here? Asked more out of curiosity than anything else. For now, she replied, gesturing for him to sit on the couch. Drink? No, I'm fine, he said, sitting down stiffly and setting his briefcase at his feet. I'm here for answers, Lana, no distractions. She smirked faintly, appreciating his determination. Fair enough. She moved to the bookshelf, pulling out a leather-bound folder. It was war-worn but well-maintained, the edges frayed slightly from years of use. She placed it on the coffee table in front of him and sat across from him in a chair. Benjamin eyed the folder but didn't reach for it. What's this? My service record, she said simply. Everything you need to know about me. He hesitated. You're serious? You're just giving it to me? You're my lawyer, she said. You need to know who you're defending. Benjamin opened the folder carefully, his fingers brushing against the pages. Inside were neatly organized documents, discharge papers, commendations, training certifications. His eyes widened as he scanned the contents. Wait, he muttered, flipping through the pages faster. You were a Navy SEAL, she finished for him. Lieutenant Commander, retired. He stared at her, his mouth slightly open. Monica, this changes everything. Why didn't you tell me before? Because it's not just about who I was, she said, leaning forward. It's about what Simmons represents. This isn't just my fight, Ben. It's about exposing the kind of corruption and bias that allows people like him to get away with this. Benjamin ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. The prosecutor's going to lose it when this comes out, and Simmons, he'll crumble. Lana's expression darkened. Simmons won't crumble. Men like him double down when they're cornered. That's why we have to be smart, strategic. Benjamin nodded, slowly understanding the gravity of her words. Do you think he knows? Not yet, she said, but he's suspicious. You saw how he looked at me today. He knows there's something he doesn't know, and it's eating at him. Benjamin closed the folder and leaned back, letting out a long breath. So what's the plan? Lana's eyes glinted with a quiet determination. Tomorrow we show the court the truth, but we don't just expose Simmons for lying, we expose the system that enables him. And how do we do that? He asked, leaning forward. Lana stood, her presence commanding even in her casual attire. She walked to the mantel, picking up the folded flag. She turned it over in her hands before looking back at him. We make him see me not as a defendant, but as the woman who spent 20 years protecting the very freedoms that man tried to strip from me. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a quiet storm brewing beneath her calm exterior. Benjamin felt a chill run down his spine, not from fear but from the sheer force of her resolve. Monica, he said softly, tomorrow's going to be a fight. She placed the flag back on the mantel, her hand lingering on it for a moment. Then she turned to him, her eyes fierce. I've been fighting my whole life, Ben. Tomorrow's just another battle. The next morning the courthouse loomed in the pale grey light of dawn, its imposing facade casting long shadows over the bustling crowd that had gathered on the steps. News of the trial had spread quickly overnight. Whispers Turning into a roar of speculation, the gallery was filled with spectators, journalists scribbling in notepads, community members eager to see justice, and Simmons's fellow officers who lined the back row in a silent show of support for their comrade inside the courtroom hummed with anticipation. The atmosphere tense and electric. Lana sat at the defense table, her expression calm but focused. Her navy blue blazer and neatly pressed white shirt gave her a commanding presence, one that seemed to silence the room even before the judge entered. Beside her, Benjamin Carter flipped through his notes, his nerves betrayed by the subtle tapping of his pen against the table. "Are you ready for this?" he asked in a low voice, glancing at her. Lana turned her head slightly, her gaze steady. "I've been ready for years, Ben. Let's give him the truth." The gavel struck and Judge Grayson entered the room, his stern face surveying the crowd. "Court is now in session. We will continue with the case of State versus Lana." The prosecutor, a seasoned man with sharp features and a suit that seemed tailored to intimidate, stood first. "Your Honor, we intend to reinforce the testimony of Officer Simmons today and present additional evidence to support the charges against the defendant." Monica didn't flinch, her hands resting lightly on the table. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, but she remained as steady as a rock in the tide. The prosecutor called Simmons to the stand again, his polished demeanor masking the growing tension in the room. Simmons adjusted his tie as he walked to the stand, his movements slower than usual, as if weighed down by the scrutiny he could feel pressing in from every angle. "Officer Simmons," the prosecutor began, his voice firm but measured, "please remind the court of the events that led to the defendant's arrest." Simmons cleared his throat, his voice carrying a hint of strain. "As I stated before, I encountered the defendant near a closed business. She was acting suspiciously, refused to identify herself, and became physically aggressive when I attempted to question her, and you stand by your account of her behavior?" The prosecutor pressed. "I do," Simmons replied, his eyes flicking toward Monica. For the briefest of moments the prosecutor nodded, satisfied. "Thank you, Officer Simmons. No further questions." Benjamin rose slowly, his expression unreadable. He adjusted his tie and approached the stand with deliberate steps, each one echoing in the silent courtroom. "Officer Simmons," Benjamin began, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made Simmons shift slightly in his seat, "you testified that my client became aggressive and attempted to reach for your weapon. Is that correct?" "That's correct," Simmons replied, his voice steady, but his posture rigid. "And yet," Benjamin continued, "you also stated that your body camera malfunctioned during the incident. Convenient, wouldn't you say?" Simmons' jaw tightened. "It was an unfortunate coincidence. Equipment malfunctions happen, of course they do," Benjamin said, nodding slightly. "But you've been on the force for what, 10 years? How often has your body camera malfunctioned during an arrest?" Simmons hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "Not often, but it happened this time." Benjamin pressed. "During an arrest where you claimed the defendant behaved so aggressively that you feared for your safety?" "Yes," Simmons said, his voice hardening. Benjamin turned, pacing slowly in front of the jury. "And is it also a coincidence, Officer Simmons, that a witness in the area captured part of this encounter on their phone?" The courtroom erupted into whispers, the gallery leaning forward as if they could will the evidence into existence. Judge Grayson struck his gavel, demanding order. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, his voice sharp, "if you have evidence present at." Benjamin returned to the defense table, retrieving a USB drive. "Your Honor, the defense submits video evidence recorded by a bystander during the arrest." The prosecutor shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defense should have submitted this earlier." "Sit down." Judge Grayson interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Let them see the footage." The BFF took the drive and inserted it into the courtroom's media system. The screen on the wall flickered to life and the room fell into a heavy silence. The footage was shaky, the angle partially obscured by the frame of a car window, but the audio was clear. Simmons's voice rang out sharp and commanding. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he said, his hand gripping Lana's arm. Her voice followed, calm but firm. "I'm not resisting. Let go of my arm." The crowd watched riveted as Simmons shoved Monica against the patrol car. His words were clear now, biting and unmistakable. "Women like you don't get to question me." The courtroom erupted again, louder this time. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, his face darkening with frustration. "Order. I will have order in this court." The courtroom emptied slowly for recess, but the tension lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. Lana sat silently at the defense table, her calm demeanor unshaken by the chaos the video evidence Evans had unleashed. Beside her, Benjamin was pacing, his hands moving in erratic gestures as he muttered under his breath. "This is huge, Lana," he said, finally stopping to face her. "That footage just tore his testimony apart." Lana folded her hands neatly on the table, her gaze steady. "It's a crack in the wall, Ben, but walls don't fall with cracks alone. We need more." Benjamin exhaled sharply, leaning on the table. "What's the next move? We've got the video, and you got your service record. We could bury Simmons with this." She looked at him, her expression softening just slightly. "It's not just about burying Simmons, it's about exposing the truth. If we rush, we risk losing control of the narrative." "Timing is everything." Before Benjamin could respond, the BFF's voice cut through the room. "Court will reconvene in 5 minutes." Monica stood adjusting her blazer. "Stay sharp, Ben, it's time." As the judge entered and the room was called to order, all eyes were on Officer Simmons. The confident smirk he had worn earlier was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped expression and darting eyes that betrayed his growing unease. His fellow officers in the back row exchanged uncertain glances, their silent support now tinged with doubt. Judge Grayson's voice broke through the tension. "Mr. Carter, do you have additional evidence to Present Benjamin rose, his movements deliberate and composed. Yes, Your Honor. The defense would like to call the defendant Monica Jackson to the stand. The room buzzed with renewed interest. Monica stood, her steps measured as she approached the witness stand. She didn't rush, didn't falter. Her presence alone seemed to command the room's attention, and when she sat, her posture was as straight as a soldier at attention. Miss Jackson, Benjamin began, his tone steady. You've heard the accusations against you: resisting arrest, assaulting an officer, attempting to seize a weapon. Are these accusations true? No, they are not, Monica replied firmly, her voice carrying across the room. Benjamin nodded. Then let's talk about what really happened that night. In your own words, tell the court how your encounter with Officer Simmons unfolded. Lana took a slow breath, her gaze sweeping the room before settling on Benjamin. That night, I was heading home after visiting a friend. I stopped to check my phone for directions. When Officer Simmons approached me, he asked what I was doing there, and I told him. When he asked for my ID, I questioned why he needed it. I wasn't doing anything illegal, and I wanted to know what his reasoning was. And how did he respond? Benjamin asked. Lana's jaw tightened slightly. He accused me of being uncooperative. When I tried to explain myself, he grabbed my arm and refused to let go despite me telling him I hadn't done anything wrong. Benjamin took a step closer to the jury, his voice rising slightly. Did you threaten him in any way? No, Monica said firmly. I told him to let go of my arm when I tried to pull away. He shoved me against the patrol car and handcuffed me. He then accused me of reaching for his weapon, which is a complete fabrication. The gallery murmured again, but Monica wasn't finished. His actions weren't about law enforcement, she continued, her voice steady but charged with emotion. They were about control, about asserting power over someone he assumed couldn't fight back. Benjamin paused, letting her words hang in the air. Miss Jackson, there's been a lot of speculation about your background. The prosecution has painted you as an ordinary civilian who suddenly turned violent. Is there more to your story that the court should know? Lana's eyes met Benjamin's, and for the first time her calm exterior gave way to a flicker of something deeper: resolve, strength, and perhaps a hint of anger. Yes, she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. There is more. The room held its collective breath as Monica leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the edge of the stand. I am Lieutenant Commander Monica Jackson, ready, head Navy SEAL, she announced, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. I served my country for 20 years, including in some of the most dangerous combat zones in the world. I've led teams on missions that require discipline, precision, and strength, qualities that I carry with me every day. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, followed by a stunned silence. Even Judge Grayson seemed momentarily taken aback, his gavel frozen in midair. Simmons' face turned pale, his jaw tightening as if he were physically holding back his reaction. Benjamin stepped forward, his voice rising. Miss Jackson, as a Navy SEAL, you were trained to handle high-pressure situations. Did you use any of that training during your encounter with Officer Simmons? Yes, Monica said without hesitation. I used it to stay calm, to de-escalate the situation, and to protect myself from harm without resorting to violence. And did you at any point attempt to harm Officer Simmons or reach for his weapon? Benjamin asked. No, Lana said, her voice firm. My training taught me how to assess threats and respond appropriately. Simmons wasn't a threat to my safety, he was a threat to my dignity, and I refused to let him strip me of that. The courtroom erupted once more, louder this time as the weight of Monica's words settled over the room. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, his face a mixture of frustration and awe. Order, I will have order in this court. When the noise subsided, Benjamin turned to the jury, his voice steady but filled with conviction. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've heard Officer Simmons' version of events, and now you've heard the truth from a woman who has spent her life defending this country. The question you need to ask yourselves is simple: who do you believe? The prosecutor remained seated, his face pale and his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. Simmons stared straight ahead, his hands clenched tightly on the arms of his chair. As Lana stepped down from the stand, the weight of her testimony lingered in the room. She returned to her seat, her head held high, and leaned toward Benjamin. Now, she said softly, let us see how long that wall holds. The tension in the courtroom was almost suffocating. Officer Bradley Simmons sat at the plaintiff's table, his face pale and glistening with a sheen of sweat. The composure he had carried into the courtroom earlier was gone, replaced by the faint tremble in his hands as he gripped the edge of the table. His fellow officers, who had been a silent wall of support in the back row, exchanged uneasy glances. They had come to see justice served, or so they thought, but now doubts were creeping into their minds like unwelcome shadows. The judge, his usually stoic face showing hints of weariness, looked over the room before turning to Simmons' lawyer. Mr. Avery, does the prosecution wish to proceed with redirect, or do you need a moment to reconsider your strategy? The prosecutor, Richard Avery, rose stiffly from his seat, his carefully curated demeanor showing the first signs of a crack. He adjusted his tie as if tightening a noose and stepped toward the witness stand. His voice, usually sharp and commanding, carried a faint edge of desperation. Your Honor, he began, we intend to call Officer Simmons back to the stand to clarify some inconsistencies. The judge nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. Proceed. Simmons stood slowly, his movements stiff as though weighed down by the growing scrutiny. As he walked to the witness stand, he avoided Lana's gaze, which followed him with a calm intensity. When he finally sat down, his hand trembled as he adjusted the microphone, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the jury. Avery approached, forcing a smile. Officer Simmons, you've heard the defendant's testimony and her claims regarding your conduct. Do you have anything to say in response. Simmons cleared his throat, his voice shaky but determined. Yes, her account of the incident is exaggerated. I acted within the scope of my duties. Avery nodded encouragingly. In the video evidence presented earlier, how do you explain what the court saw? Simmons hesitated, his eyes darting toward the jury before returning to Avery. The video doesn't show everything, it's incomplete. It doesn't capture the context of her behavior leading up to that moment. And what context would that be? Avery pressed, his tone tightening. She was defiant, Simmons said, his voice growing louder as if to regain some control. She refused to cooperate and challenge my authority. I had to act decisively to maintain order. Lana watched him with an expression that was almost pitying, her hands folded neatly on the table in front of her. Benjamin leaned toward her and whispered, he and unraveling. She gave a small nod but said nothing, her focus unwavering. Avery continued, his voice growing more insistent. So you stand by your claim that the defendant attempted to reach for your weapon? Yes, Simmons said, though the word came out weaker than he intended. She made a sudden movement toward my side. I had to protect myself. Benjamin shot to his feet. Your Honor, permission to cross-examine. Judge Grayson nodded curtly. Granted. Benjamin approached the stand slowly, his movements deliberate. He stopped just a few feet from Simmons, his presence looming without being overbearing. He let the silence hang in the air for a moment, forcing Simmons to meet his gaze. Officer Simmons, Benjamin began, his tone calm but edged with steel. You've testified multiple times that my client reached for your weapon, is that correct? Yes, Simmons replied, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. And yet, Benjamin continued, you provided no physical evidence to support this claim, no fingerprints on your holster, no corroborating testimony, just your words. Simmons' jaw tightened. I know what I saw. Benjamin nodded slowly as though considering the statement. You know what you saw, he repeated, but the court has seen something else, video evidence that contradicts your account, evidence that shows my client was calm and cooperative until you escalated the situation. That video doesn't tell the whole story, Simmons said, his voice rising. It's taken out of context. Benjamin tilted his head slightly. Out of context? Let him talk about context. Then he turned to the jury, his voice growing louder. This is a man who approached a law-abiding citizen, demanded her identification without cause, and when questioned resorted to force. A man who then lied under oath to cover his actions. The prosecutor objected, but the judge overruled him, motioning for Benjamin to continue. Benjamin turned back to Simmons, his voice dropping to a cold, quiet tone. Officer Simmons, you accused a decorated Navy SEAL, a woman who has served this country with honor, of being a threat. Tell me, does it embarrass you to know that the person you tried to intimidate has faced dangers you couldn't begin to imagine? Simmons flinched, his composure slipping further. That's irrelevant. She wasn't acting like a Navy SEAL that night, and you weren't acting like a police officer. Benjamin shot back, his voice sharp. You were acting like a bully who thought he could get away with abusing his authority, but you didn't count on her standing up to you, did you? The room was deathly silent, the weight of Benjamin's words pressing down on everyone present. Simmons opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Benjamin turned to the judge. Your Honor, I have no further questions. Simmons stepped down from the stand, his shoulders slumped as he returned to his seat. His fellow officers avoided his gaze, their earlier confidence in him now replaced with doubt. Monica watched him for a moment before leaning toward Benjamin, the walls starting to crumble. Benjamin nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Let him finish the job. The courtroom was heavy with silence as Officer Bradley Simmons returned to his seat. His confident facade had crumbled and he now looked like a man walking the edge of a crumbling cliff. The air in the room was dense, charged with unspoken tension. The jury exchanged glances, their expressions betraying growing unease. Even the judge, typically stoic and detached, leaned forward slightly as though sensing the tide turning in ways even he hadn't anticipated. At the defense table, Lana sat unmoving, her composure a stark contrast to Simmons' unraveling. Her calm presence had begun to feel almost imposing, a quiet strength that filled the room more effectively than any words could. Benjamin Carter flipped through his notes one last time, his jaw tightening in determination. This wasn't just a case to him anymore, it was a reckoning. Judge Gron cleared his throat, breaking the tense silence. Mr. Carter, he said, his voice carrying a note of caution. The defense may proceed. Benjamin stood buttoning his jacket before addressing the court. Your Honor, the defense has one final piece of evidence to present, evidence that will leave no doubt as to what truly happened on the night of my client's arrest. The gallery buzzed with whispers, the spectators craning their necks to see what would come next. Simmons shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the table. The prosecutor, Richard Avery, visibly tensed, his earlier confidence replaced with wary suspicion. Monica remained still, her gaze steady as Benjamin retrieved a file from his briefcase. He held it AOFT for the jury to see. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, his voice steady but firm, what you've heard in this courtroom over the past few days is a tale of two stories. Officer Simmons would have you believe that my client, a woman with no prior criminal record and a career dedicated to serving her country, suddenly became violent and aggressive for no reason. But the truth is far simpler and far more troubling. He opened the file and pulled out a series of documents. This, he said, holding up the first page, is Officer Simmons's personnel record, and what it reveals is a pattern of behavior that speaks to his credibility, or rather his lack of it. The prosecutor leapt to his feet. Your Honor, I object. This is irrelevant to the case at hand. Judge Grayson raised a hand to silence him. Overruled. Mr. Carter, you may continue. Benjamin nodded and addressed the jury directly. Over the course of his career, Officer Simmons has been the subject of multiple complaints: excessive force, racial bias, improper conduct. These complaints were either ignored or buried by the department, but today they come to light. He handed copies of the documents to the jury, who studied them intently. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, and even the judge's expression darkened as he scanned the pages in front of him. "Let me be clear," Benjamin said, his voice rising slightly. "This is not just about one bad decision. This is about a pattern of abuse, a pattern that culminated in the false arrest and mistreatment of my client." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room before turning toward Monica. "And now it's time for her to speak her truth." Lana rose slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. She walked to the front of the courtroom, standing tall and commanding as she addressed the jury. "My name is Lieutenant Commander Lana Jackson," she began, her voice clear and steady. "For 20 years I served in the United States Navy as a SEAL. I've been to places most people can't imagine, face dangers most people will never know, and through it all I've held myself to the highest standards of integrity and discipline." Her eyes swept over the jury, each word carrying the weight of her experience. "I have faced enemies on the battlefield, but I never thought I would face one in my own country. That night, I wasn't a threat, I wasn't breaking any laws, I was simply existing, something that for people like me often feels like a crime in itself." The gallery was silent now, the earlier murmurs replaced by a palpable sense of shame and reflection. Monica continued, her voice unwavering. "Officer Simmons didn't see me as a person, he saw me as a target, a means to assert his power and control. But what he didn't see was my strength, my resolve, and my refusal to be silenced." She turned to face Simmons directly, her gaze piercing. "You underestimated me, Officer Simmons, but more importantly, you underestimated the truth, and the truth has a way of coming to light." Simmons looked away, his face flushed with humiliation. The jury's eyes followed Lana, their expressions a mixture of awe and anger, not at her, but at the system that had allowed this to happen. Lana turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I fought for this country, I fought for justice, and I'm here today to fight not just for myself, but for every person who has ever been wronged by those sworn to protect him." The room erupted into applause, despite the judge's gavel striking repeatedly. "Order!" Judge Grayson barked, though even he couldn't hide the respect in his eyes as he looked at Lana. Benjamin stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you, Lieutenant Commander Jackson." No further questions as Lana returned to her seat. The energy in the courtroom shifted. The jury looked at her with newfound respect, their earlier skepticism replaced by conviction. Simmons, on the other hand, seemed to shrink in his chair, his earlier bravado now a distant memory. Judge Grayson leaned forward, his voice heavy with finality. "We will now move to closing arguments, and I suggest both parties choose their words carefully." The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. The tension was thick, the silence heavy as the prosecutor, Richard Avery, rose to deliver his closing argument. He adjusted his tie nervously and approached the jury, his usual confidence replaced with a strained composure. "Ladies and gentlemen," Avery began, his voice measured but lacking its earlier vigor, "what we've seen here today is a complex case. While the defense has worked hard to paint Officer Simmons as a man with a questionable record, I urge you to consider the broader picture. Law enforcement officers make split-second decisions every day, often under difficult circumstances. Officer Simmons believes he was acting in the best interest of public safety." He paused, his gaze flickering towards Simmons, whose face was a pale mask of unease. "Mistakes may have been made," Avery admitted, "but that does not change the fact that Officer Simmons was doing his job." The defense's claims, while compelling, do not erase the fact that the defendant questioned authority, resisted an officer, and escalated the situation. Avery's tone hardened as he finished. "I ask you to consider the facts and not be swayed by emotion or spectacle." "Thank you." The courtroom remained silent as he returned to his seat. Benjamin Carter rose next, his movements deliberate and calm. He adjusted his jacket, straightened his tie, and approached the jury with an air of quiet confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Benjamin began, his voice steady and firm, "what we've seen here today is not a complex case. It is in fact painfully simple. My client, Lieutenant Commander Lana Jackson, a decorated Navy SEAL and an American hero, was profiled, mistreated, and lied about by a man who abused his power." He turned, gesturing toward Lana, who sat with her back straight, her hands resting lightly on the table. "Lana did not resist arrest. She did not threaten Officer Simmons. What she did was ask a question, a simple, reasonable question. Why? And for that she was thrown against a car, handcuffed, and humiliated." Benjamin's voice rose, his passion filling the room. "This isn't just about Lana, it's about accountability. It's about ensuring that those who wear a badge and swear an oath to protect and serve are held to the highest standards of integrity, because when they fail to do so, the entire system fails." He took a step closer to the jury, lowering his voice for emphasis. "Today, you have the power to send a message that no one, not even an officer of the law, is above accountability, that justice is not just a word we say, but a principle we uphold. I trust you to make the right decision." Benjamin returned to his seat, and the courtroom fell into a heavy silence as Judge Grayson gave his instructions to the jury. Then they were dismissed to deliberate. The hours felt like days. Lana sat in the courthouse hallway, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Benjamin paced back and forth, his brow furrowed in thought. The low hum of conversation from nearby spectators and reporters filled the space, but Lana tuned it all out. "Do you think they'll see the truth?" Benjamin asked, breaking the silence. Lana looked up at him, her expression calm but resolute. "They don't need to see it, Ben, they need to feel it. The truth has a way of making itself No, Benjamin nodded, though his nerves were evident before either of them could say more. The bailiff appeared in the doorway. The jury has reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed as everyone filed back in the tension almost unbearable. Lana stood beside Benjamin at the defense table, her face an unreadable mask across the room. Simmons sat stiffly, his eyes fixed on the jury box. The fours of the jury, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a serious expression, stood as the judge addressed her. Has the jury reached a verdict? Yes, Your Honor, she replied, her voice steady. The judge nodded. Please read the verdict. The fours unfolded a piece of paper and began. In the case of State versus Monica Jackson, we find the defendant not guilty on all charges. A wave of emotion rippled through the room. Gasps, murmurs, and even a few quiet cheers broke out before the judge's gavel brought order. Lana exhaled softly, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. Benjamin placed a hand on her shoulder, a smile breaking through his otherwise professional demeanor. The fours continued. Furthermore, we the jury strongly recommend that an investigation into Officer Simmons' conduct be pursued. The judge nodded gravely. The court will take this recommendation under advisement. Officer Simmons, I suggest you retain counsel. This matter is far from over. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward, but Lana stood tall, her presence commanding as she addressed the crowd. This isn't just my victory, she said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. This is a victory for accountability, for justice, and for everyone who has ever never been silenced by those in power. I didn't fight this battle alone, and I won't stop fighting for others. Benjamin stood beside her, watching with a mixture of pride and admiration. The crowd erupted into applause as Monica turned and walked away, leaving the cameras behind. Months later, Officer Simmons was dismissed from the police force and faced criminal charges for perjury and misconduct. His fellow officers, once loyal to him, distanced themselves as the investigation uncovered more of his abuses. Lana returned to her quiet life, but her name became a symbol of resilience and justice. She was invited to speak at events, her story inspiring others to stand up against injustice. Though she had left the battlefield years ago, Monica Jackson knew that her fight wasn't over, and she was ready for whatever came next, because for her, justice wasn't just an outcome, it was a way of life. And just like that, the truth prevailed. A courageous woman stood her ground, exposing lies and demanding justice in a system designed to silence her. This story isn't just about one victory, it's a reminder that standing up for what's right can change everything. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe to my channel for more powerful stories like this one. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update, and join me as we uncover more tales of resilience, justice, and redemption. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.